The next topic is one that several of you requested in your pre-event surveys, which is best practices. And I'm very excited that so many of you wanted to talk about this. It maybe says something about me that this is what is exciting to me, but I'm very excited because I think, sort of best practices and best approaches for working with neon data is really important. And I don't get asked about it often. So here we go. And like I said, if there are things about best practices that I'm not touching on that you're interested in, just ask. So, okay, that's about tokens. First thing is to make sure you are using the data releases appropriately, which before I get into that more, what is a data release? I think some of you are familiar, but some of you are probably relatively new to the data releases. So Neon publishes data on a rolling basis. Like as the data become available, we publish them. And on initial publication, all of the data are considered provisional. And really what that means is just that those data are subject to change. If we find errors, if we find duplicates, like we talked about in the breakout room, uh, we will correct those with sort of, no warning. They will just one day be corrected on the data portal. But for things like reproducibility and citability, you don't want data that could change at any moment. And so that is what the data releases, well, one of the things that the data releases do for you. So every January, we publish a data release. The data release includes all of the data, so all the way back in time up to a designated lag time. So for the observational data and the remote sensing data, that lag time is a year. So for example, the 2025 release that came out in January 2025 did not include 2024 data. It went through the end of 2023. Once data are in a release, that release does not change. So if we find, data that need correcting, if an algorithm gets updated and the data get reprocessed, that will change from one release to the next, but each release is totally fixed. For the observational and the instrumented data, you can always go back to old releases. So if you're trying to reproduce an analysis that you did in the past or reproduce an analysis that someone else did, you can go back to the previous release that was used for that analysis the first time and know that you are getting, the same data for reproducing that process. That is not true for the remote sensing data, and that is just a matter of data volume. The remote sensing data are just too large for us to be able to keep many, many copies of the data. So for the remote sensing data, you can still cite the old releases, but only the current release and the provisional data are available at any given time. And so what this looks like on the data portal, this is just looking at the data availability graph for chemical properties of surface water. These filled in blue boxes represent data that are in release 2025. So that's, all of the data up through the end of 2023. And then the hashed boxes represent data that are available, can be downloaded, can be used for analysis, but are still provisional. And so in just a few months, in January, all of these 2024 data will then go into the 2026 release. And this figure will be updated so that you get solid boxes through the end of 2024. So what do I mean when I say use the data releases? So when you access data, when you download data, you want to keep track of which release they're in. Know what release you're working with. And if you want to always be working with the most up-to-date data, you can re-download in February every year, and you'll get, the latest release with the latest changes. Often those changes are fairly minor, but you can keep up to date by getting that newest release. Reproducibility, if you want to fully replicate an analysis, use the same release that was used. And I would say if Obviously, you can use provisional data in analyses in publications. If you're working with provisional data and you haven't published yet and a release comes out for those data, I would highly, highly recommend that you switch to using the release for that publication. So it's just sort of, being aware of what release you're working with and being aware of the schedule of releases. So sort of, keeping an eye on that release schedule and when we make announcements about the releases. There is a tutorial that helps sort of walk through, what it looks like to download specific releases and citation information and that kind of thing. So yeah, definitely check out that tutorial. I said cite a few times in what I just said. So the releases, each data product within a release is tagged with a DOI. And so that makes it super easy to cite those data. You just say, hey, I used this data product from this release. Here's the DOI, here's the citation. We have guidance on sort of recommended citations, both on the data portal and in the outputs from Neon Utilities. So this is what that looks like on the data portal for chemical properties of surface water in release 2025. This is what that looks like in a BibTeX format that you get with Neon Utilities. Obviously, you have to adapt for, the specifics of the journal that you're publishing in, but we try to make it easy by providing that citation information for the DOIs. For provisional data, we do also provide recommended citations. They don't include the DOI because provisional data don't have a DOI. And what we recommend for reproducibility and for sort of meeting the requirements for data citation from your journal, we recommend that you take provisional data and that you used in a publication and archive it somewhere like at EDI so that you can have that more stable citation to the provisional data, since it may change at Neon, and so you can't count on Neon as sort of the citation source for the provisional data in the same way. Which again points directly back to, if you use data in a release, you have a DOI, super easy to cite. But that we are not telling you not to use provisional data. Provisional data is totally usable, just a little bit more difficult to cite. Okay, another best practice, get a user account and get an API token. So we have a page on the website that sort of describes user accounts, what they do for you, what they do for us. The big things are that they get you an API token and email alerts. So if you associate an API token with your account, you will get faster downloads. So the API, the Neon API, is rate limited, meaning that there's a limit on how many requests you can make to it in a given amount of time. You get a higher limit with a token. You don't get an infinite limit. The limit doesn't go away, but you can do more. You can do more faster if you have a token. There is a tutorial on using a token with Neon Utilities, so that is incorporated in the downloading functions in Neon Utilities. And it's great to have a token. Signing up for email alerts. So particularly if you were with me in breakout group 2, you heard me say a lot about things that are about to happen, things that are on the horizon, code packages that we are, working on actively right now. The email alerts, we call them data notifications, that come from the user accounts. That is where we announce things like, hey, there's a new version of Neon Utilities. Hey, there's a whole new code package. We also announce things like if we discover a significant data quality issue with a data product, that also goes out through a data notification. And when you make a user account, you can specify that you are interested in getting notifications about particular data products or about data products in particular subsystems. So if you only want the remote sensing alerts, for example, you can indicate that in your user account. But I will say it's not like we're going to flood your inbox. I think we probably put out a data notification at a rate of, a couple a month probably. And it's just a great way to stay on top of new announcements and new features from Neon. Okay, getting more into best practices when you're actually interacting with the data. Try to avoid downloading the same data many, many times. This is just, you can do this. It will waste your time because you'll sit there and wait for the data to download when, you've downloaded it before. So the load by product function, I think, is great and super convenient, but it's really easy to use it multiple times without thinking about the fact that you're downloading the same data every time. So the recommendation is, use it, download, say, all of the data from a release, and then save that locally and do your analyses from that local copy until the next release comes out and you want to make an update, which obviously managing that and keeping track of that is going to be a lot easier if you pay attention to the releases and okay, I've downloaded the data I need from a particular release. Now I don't need to download it again until the next release comes out. And the tutorial about using provisional and release data includes a little bit of advice about sort of how to manage that and how to save things locally. But there are many options and you can do what works for you. Okay, managing download sizes. We all know that, sitting and waiting for data to download is annoying and undesirable. I think I would say the biggest thing that I see that applies to every Neon data product is what's on this slide, that when you're at the exploratory stage, really download a small amount of data. If you're just sort of poking around at a data product, like first experience with this data product, what's in it? Is it going to work for my analysis? How do I understand the different pieces of it? You don't need to download everything to do that. So try just, a site or two or a year or two, poke around, and then figure out what is the total amount of data you need and sort of move on to that larger data set after you've done your poking around. That is definitely going to make your life easier. In terms of specifically the instrumented data, this really depends on what you're doing, what your analysis is, whether this is an option. But if it is an option, you can get just the 30-minute data and leave out the 1-minute data. So almost all, not all, but almost all of the IS data products have both 30-minute and 1-minute data. Obviously, the 1-minute data are 30 times bigger. And so Neon Utilities has the option to only download a particular averaging interval. And so that can really cut down on the data volume. The other thing to keep in mind, if you're looking at the IS data, is if you are just needing, temperature data across a year or, precipitation data totals for the year, there's this delightful data product called Summary Weather Statistics that is available at, I believe, daily, monthly, and yearly time steps. I might be slightly off on what those time steps are, but massively aggregated relative to the 1 and the 30-minute data. And so if all you need is sort of general weather conditions, don't bother downloading, 1-minute single aspirated air temperature because you don't need it. The one thing about Summary Weather Statistics is currently it is only available at the core sites. We will be expanding it to the gradient sites. I don't know exactly when, but in the near future, that is absolutely on the list, is to make that available everywhere. Okay, so then managing download sizes for the remote sensing data. Obviously more challenging. The remote sensing data are massive. A few things to keep in mind if they are possible for your analysis. If you don't need the full reflectance data because you only need, NDVI, EVI, something like that, you can download just the indices. Obviously, they're much smaller than the full reflectance data. If you're only interested in specific regions, Neon Utilities has this by tile AOP function to download only the tiles that correspond to specific locations on the ground. So in this example on this slide, I'm assuming that someone, is just looking at the tiles associated with the vegetation structure data, which are these black dots. You can download just 10 tiles instead of 143. So that can, that will limit the size somewhat. They're still big data. Another option don't download any data at all. Um, because we are putting more and more of the remote sensing data into Google Earth Engine. And I know you all know we are talking about that at the next training next week. And Bridget will be guiding folks through how to work with Neon's AOP data in Google Earth Engine. Yeah, uh, come back and see us next week. It'll be great. Okay, beyond Google Earth Engine, consider working in the cloud more generally. Google Earth Engine is fantastic because they have made it so easy to, interact with the data in this, very friendly workspace. There are other platforms. There are platforms that you can use for, working with the observational and the instrumented data. And I think increasingly, as every year we add more data, Neon data are just getting larger and larger. More and more people are running into trying to do analyses that you just can't do on a laptop. So check out Cyverse, check out other cloud platforms, and see if that is going to work for you and make things smoother for you. I talked about this a little bit in breakout group 2, but we are working on expanding cloud native tools for working with Neon data in the code packages that Neon supports. And that is something that we are very much keeping an eye on, keeping our ear to the ground in terms of where is our community with the cloud? How can we help support the Neon user community in the cloud? So check out that space if it works for you, and get in touch with us if you have questions about what's possible or what you would like to see from us. And the last slide in my best practices is the one that everyone finds painful but is so essential, is read the documentation. We have a lot of information available about Neon data products, and I've sort of listed them in increasing magnitude down this list in terms of how much information you're going to have to absorb. Um, so the variables file, that comes with the tabular data downloads, very simple, gives you things like variable definitions. It's a great place to start. The data product details pages on the website tell you more. The quick start guides have sort of a standardized set of information. For the observational data products, the data product user guide goes into more depth. And for the instrumented and AOP data products, you can read the algorithm documentation as well. And that's even before you get into, you can also go all the way back to things like science designs and protocols. There is a ton of information out there, and reading it will absolutely help you understand the data products that you're working with better.